on this computer. Thank you. And if you guys do not feel comfortable being on camera to record, please feel free to turn off your video. Yes. So I work under problem gambling at the hub for the RBHAO. We have lots of our Demas friends here. They're the ones who provide our funding. So thank you for being here. And I run the Region 1 Gambling Awareness Team. If you want to continue this conversation after tonight, learn more about problem gambling, how you can promote safe gambling in the community, all different types of things, please join us. Our next meeting is April 9th at 2 p.m. I'll put the link in the chat box to register. All are welcome. Please join us. And tonight, I'm so excited to say that we're joined by Saul. I first heard Saul speak at the CCPG annual conference, and tonight he's going to dive deeper into his personal story with gambling addiction. He's going to offer suggestions on protective factors, what adults and parents can look into, and what they can put into place to help young people in all of our lives, and also touch a little bit on sports betting, because everybody seems to be so interested in that around March Madness and the Super Bowl that just happened. Let's see. And then, yeah, I think that's all I had to say. And feel free, I think Saul said he was open to questions. If you want to message me in the chat box or raise your hand, feel free. And I will turn it over to Saul now to introduce yourself.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for taking time out of your evening to join us today. So my name is Saul Malek. I am 26 years old. I live in Dallas, Texas, and I have been clean from a gambling addiction for just over 4.5 years now. I've had the privilege of speaking at different conferences and places across the country on problem gambling. So I do have a slide deck. We'll use it as a bit of a guide, but I do want to be mindful of what everyone wants to get out of this. So we don't have to adhere to it completely. I'm just going to put it up so we have it as something to reference, if that sounds good with everyone. Let me know if you can see it right now. Everyone can see that? Gosh, I'm seeing like a million tabs right now. So let me make sure that's all right. Okay, great. Thanks. All right, everyone. So last month, I had the fortune of being a part of the Mental Health America of Greater Dallas Adolescent Symposium. This was a great event talking about mental health. We had clinicians from all over the state of Texas and across the country, and we touched on all sorts of topics of youth, mental health, and wellness. So as you could imagine, there was no alcohol served at this symposium. There were no drugs being passed out. However, right before Saul Malek's presentation on problem gambling, the annual raffle was put forward and someone won a giant gift basket. And then immediately following that gift basket, I was talking about how young people suffer from depression and suicide as a result of raffles and the stock market and everything. And don't worry, Mr. Malek, it's just a free raffle. You don't have to put in any money. It's not really gambling. Heard that stuff all the time. So it goes without saying that talking about youth mental health and really just mental health in general, problem gambling takes a back seat if it's even in the car at all when you're talking about issues of wellness. So today we are going to focus on problem gambling. We are going to hear my story of going through a gambling addiction. We're going to talk about some strategies that can be employed in the community to address this issue. And I was told that sports betting is kind of a hot topic now, especially with March Madness and all this Ohtani sports betting scandal coming out. We're seeing more and more of this, so we can talk about that and really anything that you all want to talk about. It's your time, you're here, so put anything in the chat if you want me to cut something off or add something more, and we'll take it from there. All right, awesome. So if I could get the clicker to work, here we go. Here are some of my objectives, talking about sports, talking about young people, and we're going to be talking about my story with gambling. So we won't exactly adhere to it, but we'll get to the meat of these topics here. So, all right, let's see. So my story with problem gambling starts many, many years ago, which seems a little odd because, as I mentioned, I'm 26 years old and legal age to gamble in many places is only 21. Well, my gambling really began in middle school. Anyone here play in a fantasy football league or a fantasy baseball league? No, really? Oh, okay. That's a little bit shocking. I was kind of anticipating a different answer, but that's okay. I'll roll with it. All right. Many people play fantasy baseball, fantasy football, and they start with a little $5 pot. And that's how I started. So middle school was a time for me to make new friends, kind of grow up and find things that I had in common with the guys in my grade. And I found very quickly that we were all obsessed. I mean, absolutely obsessed with baseball. So we thought, hey, there's this thing out there called fantasy baseball. Let's make a league together and we'll all put in $20 at the start of the season, and that'll be a way to keep up with the game. Now, my parents were already keen to the idea that putting in money for a league could be towing the line between gambling or just following the game. And they were not proponents of it, right? So my mom said, well, you better not be gambling. I said, well, it's $20 one time. It's just the beginning of the year. That's it. So it's not really gambling. And that was a sufficient explanation. So all of you here listening to the news about sports betting and how dangerous it is and how all these young men especially are calling gambling addiction hotlines, just know that for a guy like me who did get to that point, it started as something that was a pro-social behavior. It was something that I did with my peers, and I actually learned a lot from those early years of fantasy baseball. I learned about statistics. I learned how to keep up with current events in the sports world, and I actually had aspirations of entering sports journalism or broadcasting. So it was healthy. It was a good thing. And it actually carried me all the way from middle school to high school. We had that same league, and we thought we were just going to keep doing that forever. Like when you hear these stories of guys who've been in the same league for 40 years in a fantasy football league, whatever, that's kind of the goal that we had, right? So high school comes around, and keep in mind, I'm 26 now. So when I entered high school, I want to say it was about 2012. So this was a while ago. When you talk about the gambling landscape, this was not exactly recent with all the innovations that have been coming about. And so my senior year of high school is when word started getting around about this daily fantasy stuff. Does anyone here know about daily fantasy sports? Have you heard of some of the major operators in daily fantasy lineups? Okay, so this is some common ground already. So some a little more than others have heard of this. Well, I found out about daily fantasy hockey. Actually was the first one I think I ever put in $1 on. Was there were daily fantasy hockey lineups, and I knew nothing about hockey, but I thought that it was really interesting because I didn't know anything about it and I wanted to take a pass at it. And I had that first big win from daily fantasy hockey my senior year of high school. I put in a quarter, not even a full dollar, just a quarter, something you could get a gumball with that amount. I put it in on a lineup and I got third place out of thousands of people. And I won the equivalent of a tank of gas, 35 bucks. But what was deeper than that amount of money was the feeling that I actually figured something out. I was a problem solver. I was able to use my limited knowledge of hockey to outsmart all these other people. And that felt really good. So here's something already to be mindful of in my high school days is that first real gambling win that I experienced from one of these daily lineups was for a very low amount of money, but it evoked these feelings that I was always hoping for my fantasy leagues, being smarter than everyone else and knowing the game better, a very egotistical aspect to it. So we still caught up on the story. So, I was in middle school. I did the fantasy leagues. It took me to high school, and it's still pretty tame, right? At this point, it's like, okay, if this is the whole presentation tonight, we may as well log off. Some stupid kid played fantasy football, big deal. Well, that's how it started. That's the very simple nature of how it really got going. Well, then college turned around. You can't be in high school forever. So college comes around, and I felt that I wanted more than just fantasy baseball. I was going off to college. That's where everyone's partying and drinking and, hooking up and all this cool stuff that I had no idea was out there in high school. I didn't even drink a beer in high school, guys. I remember my prom. I drank a non-alcoholic beer because I was afraid of my parents finding out I drank alcohol. So I was lame. But then college comes around. I wanted to change that. I didn't want to be some nerdy guy, some dork. So I joined a fraternity. I joined a fraternity to find the sense of belonging with all these guys that would look up to me and respect me. Didn't work out. They thought I was weird. I mean, I guess I was, and I didn't really make a lot of close connections. So I was a bit isolated in college. I was off on my own, and I needed something to feel a certain way about myself, Now, my sophomore year, I got introduced to sports betting through a friend that I had played fantasy baseball with. And this is 2017. This was before the federal government allowed states to decide whether or not sports betting online would be legal. So this was still illegal. Plus, I was underage. I was under 21 anyway, but I got introduced to it, and I was skeptical. I was skeptical to gamble, but I thought, well, what the heck is $10 on a baseball game? I do know the game better than everyone else, so I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna put it in. And that first win that night, I remember that feeling of I should do this again. I could do this for a job. This could actually be my thing. Takes very little effort, and that's something that as I get through my story here and we talk about some more general ideas with gambling, that's a theme that will be echoed is this whole something for nothing idea. There's very little effort behind placing a bet and then seeing a result. So I love that aspect of it because I'm someone who has trouble focusing and have trouble sitting still with an assignment. So with gambling, I just press a button and there we go. So sure, I won it and I thought, well, let me do it again. So I that weekend bet on football, won it again. And then this point I was hooked, right? Very early. I didn't realize it. I didn't know what was to come, but I thought, man, I'm eager for this. I'm ready for that next game. Bring it on, bring it on. And that's what happened. I got an online account on a sports book, and that gave me access to all sorts of games I didn't even know existed instead of just betting with a friend like I was at the beginning. Now I had a whole database of betting on soccer matches overseas or ping pong tennis matches. I had all this stuff I didn't know about, but I hungered for the action and I loved the idea of making money off all of this stuff. And essentially my story is that my gambling progressed from just a bet every once a day to betting multiple times a day, betting to the point where I didn't have the money to cover it. So I was relying on credit and loans. And I was gambling with all sorts of sketchy people that I didn't know. So what would happen, and this is sort of the abridged version of this part, so we can kind of move it to some of the other topics. But what would happen is I would run up debt with a person I was gambling with a bookmaker online, and I wouldn't be able to pay it. So then I would block that person's contact and then go find someone else to gamble with and then repeat that cycle over and over and over to where I owed like 10 people $1,000 each just about and couldn't cover those debts. And it's been a long journey of continuing to repay those debts, which I'm still doing today. But deeper than the money that was lost, and this is really the takeaway from my story that I want to put forward, is that gambling provided this comfort for me. And it really worked at first, is that I was coming out ahead at the very beginning, but I craved it more and more. And it gave me the feeling that I didn't get from the fraternity, I didn't get it from college, that gambling was my thing, that I had this macho sense of being better than other people, even if I knew nothing about the game. It was something that I took pride in, being able to show off my gambling wins. Now, when I was in college, and this is a crucial part of my story that I think is important to take away because I had a friend who had a problem with drug use. And I want to say the beginning part of 2018, my friend passed away. He was using drugs and he fell in his apartment and hit his head and he died from his drug use. And that sent a wake-up call to the entire school. There was a newsletter put out about risky behavior, about engaging in drug use, about partying, and his father released a video that he submitted to the school advising kids to be careful about their partying and their drinking. And I remember the 1 year anniversary after my friend's passing, I visited his gravesite in Houston. And while sitting there kind of just talking to him out loud. I remember I was gambling on sports on my phone while in the cemetery on his grave. And it was almost like an eerie foreshadowing of that was the direction that I was headed with my gambling, but I didn't realize it. And no one else realized it because it wasn't drugs and it wasn't talked about. And it's been a very difficult process. And I feel as though some of the details of the story are just redundant in terms of going back and forth to the different bookies. But what really stands out to me is just the impact it had on my relationships and on my friends and my family, in the sense that my parents could no longer trust me. And that was something that I really valued, was my relationship with my parents. But in order to maintain the gambling, I had to continue lying about the money and what was lost. So it was a whole ordeal. It really was. And I didn't get clean until I really hit a low point in 2019, where not only was I financially bankrupt, but I was destroyed in my relationships, and I had no trust, and I lost a relationship with a girlfriend, and I couldn't function in society because my entire days were consumed with not only placing bets, but thinking about the next bet or thinking about the next lie. And it was an all consuming process. And that's why people will call it a gambling career, because it really is like working another job. At least it was for me. And so I've been working diligently since 2019 to be in recovery. I go to 12-step meetings all the time, and I have a good group of support. And speaking at schools to kids has been really beneficial for me to get my story out there and feel as though I have some sort of purpose. So that's essentially where I've been, is that I used gambling to fulfill these needs in my life, and it worked at first, then it didn't. And then I just got deeper and deeper and deeper into this hole until eventually it was either pretty much die or find some sort of help. So I've been on the right side of finding help. So that is me, and that's my story. Now let's talk about how that can relate to you, your communities, because I want to make sure that we leave tonight with some ideas about how to deal with gambling in our communities. If the clicker would work here. There we go. So when I talk about gambling here, what do you guys think of? Put some stuff in the chat. I mean, what do you think of when I say the word gambling? What sort of games, what sort of ideas come to mind when you hear that word gambling? Casinos, scratch offs. Okay, wagering money, bingo, mahjong, casinos. Interesting. So we have a few answers: casinos, horse racing, slot machines. What I see in common with all of these things is something, of course, is being risked in order to receive something of greater value. There is some amount of risk that is put up in a wager. So that's what I mean when I talk about gambling, the act of wagering something in order to receive something else. It could be sports betting, it could be a casino, it could be a scratch off ticket, online slots, all of that. But this is what we're looking at, right? Okay. Glad we already have some sort of concept of what gambling is. Now, I already mentioned that I went to that facility, or to, not that facility, I'm sorry, to the conference in Dallas where gambling was not seen as a relevant issue. However, I say it is a relevant issue. Now, let me ask you guys, have you been keeping up with the news, seeing this story that I mentioned earlier about Shohei Ohtani, the baseball player? Has anyone read about that, seen something about that? Okay, I've seen a lot of nods. So they're just to catch up some people that haven't seen it very quickly. The translator for famous baseball player Shohei Ohtani has been implicated in some sports betting scandal where apparently this translator took all this money from Ohtani and was gambling it on sports. So a lot of you have seen this, and I'm starting to see gambling show up more and more in the media. So since the Supreme Court in 2018 struck down that the federal ban on online sports betting, states have now had the power to allow people to gamble online. Seems similar to the, oh, yeah. So gambling has started to become unavoidable in the media. You're seeing it on SNL. There's a skit about the sports books. People are taking note that, hey, this is really a fast growing issue, right? Okay. However, I see it described almost like a fly buzzing in someone's ear. It's like a perceived distraction. It's like a kid comes into class with his shoes untied and you say, hey, please don't do that. It's like if a kid is there in the back of the room gambling on their phone, it's like, well, you're disrupting class, not, oh, this could be the sign of a mental health concern. And so, I was reading an article where some school in New Jersey, a principal and a student were interviewed, and they talked about how people don't see gambling as an issue, that it's never addressed at conferences of school leadership. No one comes to the school and says, here's what gambling can do for you. So it's not really seen as an issue. Now, before I go any further, did anyone have any ideas of what they wanted to hear more of? Just so I know I'm still staying on the right track here. Any questions or ideas that you want to cover? So I know we're going to talk about strategies and things for addressing gambling with young people, but let's see. Signs to look for. Great. We will talk about that. All right. Thanks. So I want to make sure that we're clear that this is not a financial issue. It is in the sense that money is usually wagered in a gambling game, but I want to look beyond the buck, right? So I say gambling is this emotional issue that has financial implications. And it's interesting, guys, because I've spoken at schools all over, and the common theme that comes up is the kids asking me, how much money did you lose? And if I give the answer of, oh, a specific amount, 20,000, whatever, they say, oh man, that's really serious. That's a big deal. That's a lot of money. But if I just give them the old, well, the money's not important, it's more about the time that was lost, and I don't mention the money, they're like, well, okay, big deal, not a big deal at all, right? So a lot of people see it as a financial problem. If you didn't hit a certain threshold that you lost, it's just small time gambling, it's not a big problem. But I'm here to say, communities are impacted regardless of just the financial implications here. So what is at stake, especially when we're talking about young people? Well, time is certainly at stake. And there's a question that is put forth in the 12-step program in Gamblers Anonymous, asking if a person ever lost any time from work or school due to their gambling. And at first, my answer to that question was, no, I never lost time. I showed up to class. I was there. I was sitting there. But thinking deeper, and this is where the online gambling becomes so disruptive, is that a person can be in class or at work completely diverting their attention from their assignment because they're involved in gambling or because they're thinking about their next bet. So it is disruptive potentially of time. Then, of course, relationships are at stake. Gambling is said to be a community issue. And I believe that's true, especially when a person turns to others for loans, or they're in danger. I've had bookies that have texted family and friends saying, hey, you need to get Saul to pay me my money. So other people get involved. It's not just, hey, I'm only doing this on my own, no one else is affected. No, other people do end up being affected. And then if you think of the proper development, especially, when you're talking about young people here, think of all the normative experiences that young people go through, going to prom, playing youth sports, things like that. How can you do that if you are caught up in gambling, right? There's no way to develop in a proper manner. You're stuck behind. And that's something that I'd struggled with when kind of coming back from my gambling issues, is thinking, hey, just because I stopped gambling does not automatically place me at the same level of my friends, because that whole time I was gambling, they had all these years of proper development where they were establishing a career and growing their finances and things. And I didn't have that. So now I'm playing catch up in addition to already being behind. And that makes that sort of recovery process all the more difficult. So here we are. We're seeing that gambling it's beyond the finances. It's a real issue. So far, so good. All right. And again, feel free to chime in with any comments or questions. So intersectionality, and I see that a lot when I'm going to conferences, is to take the perspective that all of these sort of issues with mental health don't occur in a bubble. They're affecting other things as well. And I was doing a little bit of digging, and I saw online that young Black males are actually associated with the highest rates of gambling. Now, I had a friend who went to the neighboring high school to mine back in Houston, and whenever I would catch up with him, he would tell me these fantastic stories about his high school. He would say, yeah, all the kids in the middle of the day will go to the bathroom and shoot dice, and no one does anything about it. This was a predominantly Black high school. And I remember when he would tell me those stories, I always found it really funny. Like, oh, these kids are ridiculous. They're just going and gambling throughout the day in the bathrooms. But the school didn't really see it as a serious problem, so it persisted. And of course, that's just one little anecdote. But I'm just thinking, man, even 10 years ago, I was hearing about stuff like this, and it was not really brought to attention. Now, on that same topic, I was looking on LinkedIn, and Dr. Deborah Haskins, who does a lot of work in the problem gambling field, was giving a webinar recently where she talked about how in the Black community, there is an attitude that gambling could actually be the solution to a lot of problems rather than the problem. For financial problems, it could be seen that gambling is a quick fix, right? It's a way to escape emotional problems as well, because gambling can have such a numbing effect. And it's really quite curious when looking at gambling, because there are elements to it that really promise some sort of help to a person's life, like with the money and with the fun, with the social aspect to it. And that, I think, is an important part of communication when speaking of gambling to these communities, is addressing their existing notions about gambling, because they may see it as something that could be beneficial rather than potentially destructive. And also, you think about how in minority, lower income neighborhoods, you see a lot of liquor stores, you see a lot of fast food restaurants. Well, I believe it's something to keep an eye out. We're going to start seeing a lot more game rooms and gambling being pushed to these sort of communities, and then being able to be proactive about that and really educating these groups before they're just being blasted with promotional offers and things, because certainly they're not well equipped to handle these issues. Now, ADHD, impulsivity. Hope I haven't been twitching too much. I actually had this piece of string in my hand. I just thought that it was off camera and not visible. But that is to say that I have been diagnosed with ADHD since I was a very young person. And ADHD and impulsivity naturally are associated with problem gambling. Now think of it. I mean, guys, doesn't it seems intuitive, right? That you would think not poor, but impulsive decision making would result in choices like gambling without a second thought, right? And it's really too bad when you look at the nature of a lot of these responsible gaming initiatives. And I'm not here to play politics or really get too deep into what the industry is doing, but I think that it's important as members of the community and people who work with younger people to acknowledge that a lot of the messaging that's out there puts the onus on the consumer to be more thoughtful about their gambling technique, or to be mindful of their bankroll and things. But you have a 15-year-old boy who found an online account and has no real development in their decision making, their prefrontal cortex, then it's very difficult to imagine that that will end positively, right? Because they're so impulsive. So that's an important thing to discuss with the young people. Hey, if you have ADHD, if you're an impulsive thinker, this is something to really look out for. And I see the comment in the chat of signs to look for in kids who might be gambling. That's about to come up in the slideshow as well. So that really kind of follows this. Now, depression, anxiety, these are all natural byproducts of problematic gambling. And then I think with financial status, something that I've noticed is gambling really can be appealing to people on both sides of the coin, so to speak. Because I go to a private school and I hear the kids talk about how they get such an allowance or their parents don't care. They're pretty much running on a model UN budget. I don't know any of you have ever done Model UN in high school, but essentially the budget you're allowed, you can essentially do whatever you want with. So these kids are on the Model UN budget and they're really just gambling at leisure with parents that are actually okay with it and making deposits for them and making accounts for them. And so they're good to go. But if you look at the other end and you look at kids who have nothing, then what in their mind is stopping them from getting involved in gambling? Because, hey, I have nothing to lose anyway. If I put in $5 on a crazy, crazy parlay and I could win $25,000, well, shoot, that seems like an easy trade-off that I am willing to participate in. So teaching financial literacy is very important. Understanding the value of a dollar is very important because $5 doesn't seem like much, but if you think, hey, I have to work this many hours to be able to maintain this sort of lifestyle, well, that puts it into perspective just a little bit better. All right, how are we doing, guys? How are we feeling? Doing okay? All right, I see a thumbs up, so I think we're doing well. All right, great. Another thumbs up. Okay, cool. So an issue that comes up, and especially notable here in Texas, as you can maybe see on this map, Texas is one of the states with no problem gambling resource allocation. So we have a lack of financial resources in our communities, but also a lack of resources in the mental health field. And that's tough because ultimately problem gambling, if it is a mental health condition, which I see it as such, you would naturally want to send someone to counseling, but you don't really have a lot of counselors that are well trained in dealing with problem gambling. And now an issue again is with the family. And for all of you on this call that work with these different community initiatives and everything, a lot of the focus I see on outreach has to do with the kids or the person who may be gambling, right? A lot of the program is designed to say, hey, we're trying to prevent so and so from gambling. But I think a lot of these resources need to be directed toward families because ultimately families are the ones that are, I mean, they're not in charge of the decision making of the person gambling, but they're the support network. They're the ones that can either offer support, they can enable the person to where it's actually detrimental, or they can outcast the person who's struggling. So I think, hey, family doesn't know a lot about problem gambling. And even my parents, who are very well educated people who care a lot about me, they knew very little, if anything at all, about the nature of my gambling problem. They didn't really know a whole lot. And then working in the community, I feel like we can glance over that because you guys are working in the community and we can use our time towards some other stuff here unless someone needs me to stop there. All right, good. Okay. So, an issue, guys, with gambling in today's day and age is that you're not taking a road trip to Atlantic City where everyone can physically see you sitting in front of a slot machine. It is now the hidden addiction. So how is it hidden, you may ask? Well, I'll answer that. First of all, as mentioned previously, the problem is the solution. It's tough because winning it back can be the solution. And that's what I saw. Hey, I had all this debt from gambling, but I remember driving down McCullough in San Antonio, and it's so weird. I have this exact recollection of where I was driving, where I had this God sort of nirvana, whatever realization, thinking the Marlins are going to win tonight. That's what's going to bring me back to even. And I didn't win the bet. And I'm sure even if I had, I would not have done anything with that. But it was such a tight grip in my mind that, hey, winning it back or getting a bailout, getting a loan will be the answer to this problem that I've created. So that's tough. And of course, lack of outward signs. I'm sure that we all are aware that if you gamble, you're not going to show up with a sickly appearance or smelling like a substance or anything, unless you're in a smoky casino. But that's just one way. But anyway, and then there's the MGM Grand in Vegas. Well, I hope I don't get sued, but I came up with the AT&T Grand because all you need is internet connection, and you are ready to gamble. You don't have to go to Vegas anymore. And then this is a really important talking point that I think we will dwell more on when talking about dealing with kids and looking at signs, is that it is socially acceptable. Everyone's doing it. And not only is everyone doing it, but it's a way to make friends. It's a way to make connections. And I don't know if any of you have heard Dan Trillaro speak before in Connecticut, but he made a really interesting point at the last event where I saw him present. And his point was that a lot of these kids are getting more pleasure out of the whole social aspect of the gambling than even the betting itself. Being in the group text, getting to brag to your friends and being, you know, caught up in that whole aspect of it is almost better than the actual action of gambling. So becoming a gambling gumshoe. Now, gumshoe, I learned, is another name for a detective. So if you want to look like any of these guys here, preferably without the cigarette in your mouth, then stay here and we'll figure that out right now. So the lingo, before I read these and go over these, who knows a lot of gambling lingo already? Because I don't want to go over this if it's redundant. See some thumbs up. Yeah, a little bit on the fence, a little iffy. Okay. All right. Well, let's just briefly go over some of this gambling lingo then. Because if the kids are gambling, they're also talking about it. So the spread is the amount of points one way or the other that a team has to cover in order to win a bet. It's to make the bet more even. So if the Rockets are supposed to win against the Pistons by 8 points, the line will, or the spread will be 7.5. If the Rockets win by over 7.5, it wins. If they don't, you don't win, right? So you got to cover the spread. Now there's a whole deal called bad beats on ESPN. And in bad beats, they're not talking about spoiled produce at the local grocery store. No, bad beats is about gambling events that at the very last second turn sour. So if I have a winning ticket and then on the very last play of the game, someone hits an 80-foot three-pointer and then I lose, that is a bad beat. And you would think that that would turn people off from gambling if they experience something like that. Oh, I know very little. Okay, I was reading the chat. Excuse me. So you would think that a bad beat would turn someone off from gambling because they don't want that heartbreaking loss. But what's interesting is that these gambling companies have actually turned a bad beat into part of the fun of the experience, is that you can post about it online and share in the comments about how someone sold your parlay, they ruined your bet. And so that's a whole part of the action too, is experiencing a bad beat. And it almost gives this feeling, well, I need to hit it next time because I was almost there. It's that near miss. Now, a book or a bookie, short for a bookmaker, it's someone who takes the bets from the gambler. They'll set a line, they'll set the odds, and then they'll be the ones that are taking the action. So when I was gambling, I had mentioned that I owed a lot of these bookies. So these were all people that I was exchanging the money with. They were taking my bets. Now, if you hear someone talk about a favorite, of course, it's a team favored to win, and a parlay. So question, what has the worst odds of any sports bet? What sort of, okay, no one knows. So parlays are traditionally the worst odds of any sports bet. And parlays are bets where, the whole ticket is multiple games and they all have to hit in order for it to be a winning ticket. So if you place 3 basketball bets, all 3 of them have to win. Now, the catch is you win a lot more money that way because you hit something with worse odds, but they're less likely to win. The problem with it is I still see it. I don't even gamble anymore. I see it all the time on social media that random humongous parlays are being shared as encouragement for people to gamble. It's like, hey, you could be like John T, who just hit this amazing parlay. He put in $5 and he won 25,000 on a 13-leg parlay. So they have terrible odds, but they seem very appealing because a lot of people are putting in a small amount to win something huge. And it's almost like a game. Like, any of you go to a soda fountain and put in every single flavor and just mix it because it was funny? Well, that's what's happening with these parlays is you're trying to create the goofiest parlay to put in the group chat, and it becomes like a contest. So that's something kids are really getting into. Now, if someone says something's a lock, it's assuming that it's an automatic win, which in gambling nothing is a lock, but people are believing that it is. Then money line is just a straight bet on the winning outcome. So for a sports game, Astros money line, you would just be taking them to win. Then there's betting on the over or under. So that's, for instance, betting on over under the Rockets will win 40 games this year. You say, oh, I think they're going to win more, or no, I think they're going to win under that. So you can place bets on that. If you hear that sort of terminology, that's what that is referring to. And then action, it's another way of saying someone's money, their bet, hey, he's taking action, taking bets. And then people talk about hedging a bet. So that's, betting on the opposite of what it's like buying insurance on your bet. Essentially, you bet one way and then think, oh, it's not going to work. Let me put money back on the other side once the game already started, something like that. So that's the lingo. But how do we recognize the behavior? Because even someone who's the most tried and true gambler is not going to go around speaking like they're in a casino 24/7. There's got to be more to it than just the lingo. So how about the behavior? Something I've noticed is checking the phone a lot. And I know we're in a digital age where everyone's always on their phone, but it is a sign because the gambling has turned digital, and especially secretive phone use, like putting a phone, like if I would put the phone on my lap and look at it when I thought no one was paying attention. And that's very much a sign that, hey, someone's potentially betting, but you wouldn't intuitively think of that, right? Just someone being on their phone, they might be texting. I say that is something to look out for. Now, a preoccupation with sports, and it's really tough in a society that loves sports to think that preoccupation with sports could be something gambling related, but see people all the time that have too much importance is placed on the outcome of a sports game. Well, that could be due to their gambling on the sports game. And then I think this is pretty self-explanatory. Asking other people for money could be a sign that, hey, you're running into debt and you're struggling with your gambling. But it's not on the slide, but I do want to say that something else that is noticeable with gambling at its deeper stages is isolation. And for me, that was especially noticeable. I want to say maybe 5, 6 months into my gambling when I was really starting to gamble very heavily. I was isolating a lot and not just physically. Again, I mentioned earlier the loss of time, but just being out of it, not being involved in conversations, feeling like I'm somewhere else and not spending time in those same activities is a big sign that, hey, this person could be gambling, right? That's not to say all of these things mean someone is gambling. It's just to say, hey, look out for these things because these are important aspects. Now, before we go on to the next slide, something that always concerns me about looking out for gambling behavior in the young people and in the communities is drawing a line between observing behavior and being disciplinarian and all that versus encroaching on the freedom of a young person. Because I remember growing up that whenever my mom would check in with me about all the homework I hadn't done, I just felt like she was always on top of me and it was just annoying and I didn't want to hear it. So there is really a balance, I would say, between being the parent or being the adult and also giving the kid a little bit of freedom. And I'm not a parent, at least not yet, but what I've come up with, and I'm curious if you guys want to throw in the chat some strategies that you've had of having these sort of conversations or these interventions. But what I think is really useful is having ongoing conversations about gambling with kids or just incorporating it into daily conversations about current events. So, like the Otani deal, I mean, bringing that up into conversation when talking about sports and then using that as a way of telling kids, hey, if this is something that has happened to you, if you feel like you have an issue with this, you can always talk to me, right? So I see that as a way of organically bringing it up into conversation. But that's just one idea. I can tell, that it is a sensitive subject, especially as kids feel that they're always being monitored online. But these are just a few strategies for recognizing behavior that I've noticed. But again, feel free to drop anything in the chat if you've done some other ideas or have some other ideas that you like. Let's see. So also knowing the excuses, and people, especially people that have gambled for a while, are very good at coming up with some excuses as to why it's not a problem for them, or why it's working out for them. Let's see, we do have a chat. Hold on. Parents, okay, good point. Yeah, I've seen it a lot with kids who see older folks in their life, parents, older siblings, etc. Right. So um, okay, we'll take that right now, and then we'll go back to this slide. I like Matt's point here. Can everyone see what Matt said in the chat? Everyone seeing that? What's important as well, I think, what Matt's getting at, hopefully reading this correctly, is that modeling behavior for young people is very important, especially as adults are seen as the authoritative figures for young people. So something I mentioned last time when I gave one of these talks was that clearly communicating gambling behavior to kids is important. So as an adult, if I have money on March Madness and I'm doing it in a social way, explaining, hey, I have this money on this game, it's a way for me to enjoy the game. I'm not doing it as a way of making money. I worked for this money. This is not a way to get rich. This is not something that is going to take up all my time. So explaining clearly the motives behind that sort of behavior, and then also being very deliberate in gift giving, right? Not giving out scratch off tickets to little kids, or not setting kids up with an account online, and very clearly communicating what is going on. Because you're right, Matt, that it's like passing the torch. And I hear that all the time in these meetings I go to, is that people will say, oh, my dad would take me and my brothers to the horse track, and those were my best memories, was going out there and betting money, and I used to play cards since I was 12. Well, I'm not saying to abolish all games or even abolish gambling or anything. I'm just saying, hey, we gotta be mindful of what our behavior is speaking to the next generation, and what sort of messages we're giving them as to what is appropriate behavior. What does this mean? What does financial responsibility look like? And those are all very practical, important things, right? Okay. So here's some excuses. Guys, it's just bonus bets. It's dude, they gave this to me. It's just literally playing with house money. It's just a bonus bet. And the point that I make, again, is not that every single person who gambles does have a problem, but if you're using this as an excuse as to why you can't have a problem because you're just gambling with house money, then that all goes back to that same conversation of how much time are you spending on it? What does it mean to you? Is it impacting your mental health? Is it disrupting your routine in life? So I think that's important to hammer the point across with one of these excuses of, well, it's not just about the money. There's people that are losing their time and energy to it regardless. Then there's the whole literally everyone is doing it. And that's tough, I think, for kids to swallow, is that they are in charge of their own decision making. And that's why when I talk to schools, my perspective is empowering choices rather than forcing kids to do a certain way of behaving. Because if I say, well, yeah, if everyone jumped off a cliff, would you do it? Shame on you. You shouldn't do it. Well, I don't want to tell them what to do and then have them tune me out and I'm some nagging adult. I want to empower them. Well, what do you choose? What do you want to do? What is healthy for your life? Okay, well, now I have some agency over my choices, which is very important, especially with the whole, I'm going to sound like such an old fart here, but with social media being so much groupthink, I have a mentor in my 12-step group. Anytime anything goes wrong in the news, he says, oh, it's that social media. And he doesn't even know what it means really, but there is some truth that different social media platforms encourage echo chambers and people going along with the crowd because it's cool. So that's why it's important to, hey, inspire people to make their own choices so that they're not caught up in what everyone else is doing. And then, hey, I'm up like $200 this week. People will say that, but seeing the grand scheme of things, a lot of those same people are not ahead overall, or they, or misreporting the numbers. And that's not all the time, but it's just something to be, ask them, hey, you're up 200 this week. Well, what, write down every time you gambled. This other time, were you up or down? Well, let's get some more information there, right? So I say it's good to get them to stop if it's unhealthy, and especially because it is illegal for people that are underage to be gambling. So we hope, right, that minors are not gambling. It's great, but that's not the whole story, right? It's not the whole story, because stopping gambling is great, but that doesn't mean coping with life, right? So there's a story, right? There's a story. There was a guy driving from Alabama to Texas, and midway through the drive, he got pulled over by a cop, and the cop said, I caught you going 90 miles an hour back there. You also ran over a pedestrian over there, and you were drunk, so you're going to jail. The guy says, really? Well, I haven't gambled in the last 12 months. See, that doesn't get you out of it, right? It's not all about stopping gambling. There's more to life to it. So that's the whole point of really giving a full scale conversation with young people is saying, hey, gambling prevention, yeah, it's about gambling, but it's really more about decision making and choices, which again, I'm not delusional in thinking that every kid is going to change overnight, especially when they have impulsivity and things, but let's at least get the information out there. Let's at least get the seeds planted so that when they're off in college, they'll think a little differently about it. Does that sound reasonable? Yeah, okay. So let's take some action, and not not like this guy here taking all these horse racing bets. Now we're not going to take their action. We're going to take action against this issue. So as my little stick man here likes to say, let's go after the complete picture. Let's reemphasize that we want to create fully healthy young people, not just people who are white knuckle abstinence from gambling. They can't cope with life, right? So I already mentioned this, having organic conversations, just because gambling is such a prevalent issue. And I put it on the side here. I say gambling nowadays, it's not a question of if your kid will get involved in gambling. It's a matter of when. When will they be exposed to it? Because no one's living under a rock here, right? We're seeing it all over. If you watch any sort of sports programming, if you have any form of social media, it's there, right? And so I say, if we're going to talk about it, let's avoid stigmatizing language. And I don't know, I don't see all the participants here right now, but if Jim is still on the call, Jim and I had an interesting conversation at the Wisconsin conference on problem gambling. And he made a great point saying, hey, we're at such a point in this whole problem gambling debacle where any sort of gaming is really seen as a negative thing, even though there are word games or certain math games that really inspire creative thinking. My point with that is by stigmatizing games or gambling as a whole, then we're painting this giant one-sided picture and there's no nuance and kids can't think, and then they're afraid to come forward if they have any issues. And then they also don't know the whole picture because, again, there's things like the stock market where people have long-term investments. Adults are in the stock market in a healthy way. I think kids need to know the whole picture and not just be stigmatized into thinking any sort of chance is inherently awful and you should be ashamed and you should avoid it. And the kids themselves, they're not bad if they gamble. And I'm very deliberate with that. I've had kids in my presentation say, hey, I'm in a fantasy whatever league. Does that make me bad? Say no, but your choices will have consequences. I think that if I were to sum it up in any way, it would be that kids are not bad, choices have consequences, right? And then again, involving the family because a child's day not ending at school, right? So here, I set this up perfectly because I wanted to segue into talking about things like the stock market and things that are mainstream and acceptable and even potentially helpful, right? Um, First, I know I feel like I've been just yapping. So does does anyone have any thoughts, any questions? I always like to check back in. No, we're good. Okay. Good, good, good. I will continue to check the chat box. So maybe you guys didn't consider it, but things like the stock market game. This was something that I had as a fifth grader. I remember that as a way of learning about money and learning about the stock market, my elementary school did the stock market game. The thing is, it wasn't really explained to us how the stock market can be done responsibly. It was just, hey, pick some stocks, see how you do, check in on this website. There was no real mention of what day trading or gambling or anything. And I remember I really, really loved the logo of National Oil Well Varco. It was some oil company in Houston, and it had a giant orange circle, and I really liked it. So I remember telling my partner in the class, why don't we just put all of our money into National Oil Well Varco? He said, well, no, I think we should do this other stuff. And I don't remember how it turned out, but even from that young age, I was not a healthy perspective. And I'm not blaming the school for that thought process, but you know, it was it was just the way it was. Let's see. All right, can everyone see this comment? Stock market game in fifth grade is probably less dopamine inducing than the online versions that are available now. That is a great point, Sean. I appreciate you bringing it up because today's stock market game, you're right, it's completely different. There is a stock market sort of trading app that is completely gamified called Robinhood. And what's scary about Robinhood to me is that some kid who's able to get a Robinhood account can fully convince themselves and others that they're investing. And that word is so commonly used to describe gambling behaviors that, oh no, it's just investing. So that's an important part of talking about the stock market now, I believe, is that there's legitimate stock investment, but then there's also these gamified sort of things. Another point of exposure for kids is marketing branding on teams, players' jerseys. For example, Bet365 on an NBA jersey. That's another good point, is that advertising, and I heard this one, which I really liked from someone, I forgot who, but he said advertising, they advertise because it works, not because it doesn't work. So that sort of thing is effective, putting Bet365 on a jersey and kids wear it to school, and then all of a sudden, they're tempted to participate. And I will say on that note, Matt, something else that I've noticed is a lot of the media being consumed online is encouraging of kids trying to become famous gambling streamers, people on Twitch. And the harm in that to me, first, is that it's promoting a lack of real effort. It's one of these get rich quick things. If I can just, all I have to do is get on Twitch and stream myself gambling, and I'm going to make $1 million. I'm going to be like a celebrity. I'm going to be like Drake. It's not realistic. It doesn't promote legitimate work ethic from what I can see. It's one of these get rich overnight deals, but it's also this false idea that these games are a lot more fair than they really are, because you see a celebrity like Drake who's gambling online using the company's money and he's winning. That's not the same experience that Joe Schmo kid is going to have when they get online. So that's a whole part of the conversation I have with kids about being a smart consumer of media, is looking out for these traps. And it's, hey, these advertisers get the big bucks to make sure that these products are as alluring as possible. I'm not here to say I'm going to squash that in a 20-minute story or something, but it is helpful, I think, to at least have more ammunition than you did otherwise to know what you're going up against, right? March Madness. Anyone watch University of Houston nearly collapse last night against A&M? Gosh, someone from Houston, that was an interesting endeavor for me to watch it, but I made sure I wasn't too invested in it mentally. But anyway, March Madness is so mainstream. And I hope I haven't told this story a million times, whoever's on the call, but I worked at a what was it? It was a behavioral health center, and we had a van driver named Caesar who drove the patients back and forth. Caesar hardly spoke any English. He never watched a game of basketball in his life. And yet, for about a week when I was coming into work, the entire staff was bothering Caesar about why he didn't have his March Madness bracket filled out. And there's poor Caesar just like, hey, can someone give me the van route, please? Like, I mean, he had no idea, but it's so widely accepted. It's like, hey, if Caesar's not doing the March Madness bracket at work, he's the weirdo, right? So it's everywhere. It can't be avoided. World Series pools, and then like that conference I went to in February, the raffle preluding the talk on problem gambling because people don't see it. And then we had a high school casino night at my high school. So you don't consider that a lot of this stuff is just so mainstream. And here, let's see, we have a comment. Some of the popular educational tools to teach ATOD prevention include bingo and raffle type games. Okay, interesting. I've actually seen on Instagram as well that there's some gambling prevention pages that use some sort of a wheel in order to get people to pay attention to different topics. You spin a wheel and then you can win a little thing. And I think, well, I'm not here to rag on people, but that's almost counterintuitive. Or is it? Because you could argue Jim's point of, hey, not all games or whatever are necessarily even bad. It's like, what are the motives behind it? It's just an organization trying to get awareness, and they're not really gambling. So there's some nuance to it, I think, right? Because if you have a bingo or raffle type game, a lot of people are not going to have an issue with it. I think it's just a matter of clearly communicating the expectations for that game and having resources available for people that can't participate, because I can't even imagine in a classroom setting being told, hey, if any of you guys think you have an issue with gaming, or if no, not even that. Hey, if you don't want to participate, you don't have to. I can't imagine that. So that might be kind of the workaround to that. So gambling's not going away. I think that goes without saying, but here we are again, reemphasizing that the motives behind the game or the gambling, they do matter. Not everything is created equally. Hey, let's prepare for reality, because a lot of these kids, a lot of these young people are going to experiment with it. And what I always say with these talks in different centers is that set your expectations very realistically. Don't I advise against thinking, oh, we're going to prevent all these kids from experimenting with it. I don't think that's realistic because they are curious. But I do think a good outcome is saying that kids now have more information than they did before. Now they know where to turn to, and they have an idea of where they can go if they're struggling. Um, but also part of that reality, I say, is there's parents out there who say, "Well, Saul, you've stopped gambling. You're great. This is amazing. What do I do to make sure my kid doesn't ever touch this?" And I say, well, you can do the best amount of prevention work. You can monitor all their transactions. You can tell them the dangers of the consequences of gambling, and they can still wind up doing it. And that's a big part of the conversation too, is that despite people's best efforts, ultimately each person will make their own choices. And there will be suicides from gambling. It's just inevitable, and there will be a lot of heartbreak from this. That doesn't mean, of course, to stop sending these messages, but it is just a point of saying, hey, this is the landscape we're in. This is a really harsh topic that carries a lot of destruction with it, and that's just the reality of it. Now, we're talking about kids. When kids go off to college, they are pressured into gambling in the fraternity or gambling with their friends. And so that's why it's so important now to get these messages out early, so that when kids do go off to school, they have more of a sense of what is awaiting them. My talk in Connecticut recently, I mentioned the story of Jason Francis's Yeezys. So Jason Francis was a Jamaican guy from my fraternity who had a very expensive taste in fashion. And my first college party that I ever attended was at the Kappa House. and I drank way too much jungle juice because I'd never really had any alcohol before. And so instead of ending up in my stomach, the jungle juice ended up all over Jason Francis's $700 Yeezys because I was throwing up everywhere. And I remember just thinking, man, I was mortified. That was so embarrassing. But part of me thought, well, shoot, I didn't really know any better because I hadn't really heard about how extreme alcohol was. So a thought that I've had before is, well, should adults then model responsible gaming and actually have kids gamble with them so that they can mimic responsible gambling further down the road? And I really struggle with that as the solution. So the best thing that I've come up with are is just about the outreach and the conversations and demonstrating the behavior properly as adults to where the kids can just kind of see it and just having the conversation. But that's something that I'd like to see in the chat if anyone has any ideas. I mean, what do you think? Do you think that actually having a kid gamble with an adult is a way to slowly kind of introduce them to it the way Europeans have kids drinking? I am curious because I will be the first to admit I don't know what the absolute right answer is on that one. But I think no matter what, it is important that we think about that of how do we get the kids to really know what they're getting into. Um, and then if we see any messages, I'll take a look, see it doesn't work in reality with alcohol. Okay, so that kind of confirmed my suspicions. No, it wouldn't work with gambling either. All right, thank you for that. Um, let's see. Say it's important to show that you understand. I think a lot of the time, so I've heard from school speakers about alcohol addiction. Okay, good to know. I keep that in my back pocket. Thank you. Um, I say it's important to understand what today's kids are going through because in a lot of this messaging, so much of it is extreme and fear-based and just really trying so hard to save these kids that I feel a lot of the time the kids' feelings are not validated. And I don't say that I agree with what some kid thinks about his gambling habits, but I try to do my best to acknowledge that, hey, some guy feels that his gambling is beneficial to him. I do want to validate, hey, those are your feelings. That's genuinely how you feel. And I know that it's difficult to stop because here was my experience. So at least if I'm willing to have a conversation at that person's level, I feel that the message is a lot better understood than coming from a place of lecturing. I'd rather show that, hey, even if your thinking is distorted, well, let's talk about it, right? Before just dismissing those kids, right? Oh, shoot, that's not where I wanted to go. Okay, so can you guys see Squidward on your screen right now? Okay, good. So in this episode of SpongeBob, that's where Squidward's talking about the future. So as we move to the future, I say, what are some new policies that we can have? We're just talking about schools right now. Schools have policies about drugs and alcohol. What will gambling related policy look like? Will it say that sports betting is outlawed at school? Will we say that fantasy leagues are not allowed in school? How is that sort of thing enforced? And I don't really have amazing answers right now, but I posit these sort of questions to just get you all thinking as you go back to your communities. What can we do on a practical level to do something about youth gambling? What can we do on our sports teams? Can we implement some sort of policy that allows struggling young people to get help, but still enforces enough consequence so that we're still the adults in charge? So I think it's important to look at, well, yeah, what will we do? What are some policies here? And then new ways to gamble are going to come up. And what I think is really important is someone who doesn't gamble but likes to talk about these things. I make sure that I do my research and do my reading on what's going on in the gambling landscape so that everything that I'm saying is as relevant as I can make it because things are changing so rapidly. I was just reading this article today about it was some gaming company that was looking at making their gambling products a lot more personalized and immersive moving forward. So being in an online casino wouldn't just be a generic lobby anymore. It would be specifically catered to that person and their thinking and their likes and dislikes. And to me, that really spells a lot of trouble. Now, of course, it will make for a much more entertaining gaming experience, but at the same time, then it becomes a lot harder to consume media in a healthy way if the advertising is really specifically designed for that individual person. So I think, hey, in order to combat this, let's keep up with these new ways to gamble so we can think of new ways to prevent and educate and let people know what's coming. And then I think there really is a need for more gambling related expertise. I'm not a licensed counselor, at least not right now. I have made that consideration of that being something I might look into. But I think even just being knowledgeable about gambling to any sort of degree, that's important because there's not much known and it can be isolating to not have a treatment provider that knows about it. So I would tell you this, I mean, even having conversations like the local pediatrician or people in youth centers and say, hey, have you thought of incorporating gambling into your screenings, or have you, thought to look out for this as a potential problem? Because I would say that this whole gambling crisis, whatever you want to call it, is really only getting started. And, what will we see 5 or 10 years down the road with all this? I think that's something to be mindful of. So I think we have about 15 minutes, which is exactly kind of where I wanted to leave it for any questions or thoughts. I figure that gives us some time to come up with some ideas and have some discussion. So how's everyone feeling? Did you guys get anything great out of this? Do you wish you had gone to dinner instead? I mean, what are we thinking? All right. I'm keeping my eyes out. Oh, thank you, Sherry. I appreciate it. And I hope we talked enough about the sports betting because I know that was a point of emphasis. So I did hope that came up enough with the parlays and the social aspect of it and the bad beats and everything.
Yeah, I really appreciated your like definitions of the lingo. I like know what they are like textbook wise, but coming from you makes more sense. So thank you.
Oh yeah, of course. That was really kind of a point for me as someone who was gambling was I felt like I was learning as I went along in the gambling world what all these different things meant. And I was sort of learning while also struggling with the compulsion. So I think it's nicer to learn about it in this sort of controlled environment. Um, Oh, yeah. So this is interesting. It's infuriating that some universities are partnering with sports gambling companies. So I'd seen that. And from what I read, I think Colorado was one of them. And then they pulled out of that partnership and then LSU as well. But there may still be a few. I would have to look into that. But those other ones I saw, they were coming under some heat. Oh, here, ask to unmute. Haley, I see a raised hand.
Hello. Thank you, Saul. Great presentation. I know you were talking a lot about the prevention strategies and just I know you've done this talk all over. When talking with parents, is there one message you think sort of resonates, or is it that talk early, talk often, or what just for parent messaging, your thoughts on that?
Right. Okay, great. Thank you for the feedback. I'd say what really resonates with me for parents is to be consistent. I think that's the tagline I would use. And what I mean by that is kids are really good at convincing parents everything is okay. And a lot of these strategies with monitoring the kids, they almost seem so short term, like, oh, if your kid tells you one thing one week, then it's all good. I say for parents, be consistent, be constantly vigilant as to what's going on. And then also be consistent and a tagline that I like that my mentor has told me is trust but verify. So that's an actionable item I give for parents is trust your kid, give them the benefit of the doubt, but verify what they're telling you that it lines up and it makes sense. So that's a big one.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, thank you, Juliana. Congratulations on your recovery. I know it's hard. You're right. This will be, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the kind message. And yeah, I totally agree that, and what's even more frightening about the gambling is that there is no OD really. It's just continuing down a deeper and darker path that is all mental. And it's difficult because I don't prescribed the idea that there is a cure. So really, it's just a matter of, again, being consistent as someone who has this problem in thinking that I'm not cured from it. So I better be vigilant about my decision making too.
It was interesting. Someone I've heard someone else who shared their story in recovery, and they said, in her opinion, like suicide was the overdose for someone with a problem with gambling. So that was how she phrased it, which was interesting.
That's a very, very good way of seeing that, because I don't like the idea of someone saying, "Oh, I reached rock bottom," because my thought is, if you're still alive, you have a chance at fixing whatever's going wrong. But real rock bottom is just being dead, really, from the addiction, and it's really a shame, especially as I think about all the young people who have this unwritten future for them already, to think that gambling is where all that energy is going. I mean, just how devastating for all the parents. But real quick on that note, this is another thing to consider with the whole intersectionality bill, is that there is a concept I heard of from a social worker named Mark Sanders, and he brings up the idea of recovery capital. And recovery capital talks about the strengths in a person's life that would make them more likely to stay in recovery, such as financial support, having a good network of friends and family, having a good job prospect, all these sort of positive factors that could influence someone to stay in recovery. So when we talk about painting the whole picture, I think it's important to try to build up someone's recovery capital too. And what's been kind of tough for me to swallow sometimes is thinking that, yes, I've done the work to get better myself, but at the same time, I was young, my parents were still supporting me, I had a college degree, I felt like I had a lot of things going, so it was a lot more easy for me to warm up to the idea of getting help. But I can't even imagine of the poor communities that are going to be just devastated by this issue, and they're not going to have any resources, and people aren't going to say anything, and it's just going to be a matter of, hey, you didn't want it bad enough, when really, like, man, like, I had all these factors to deal with. Let's see. It seems like gambling continues to become more accessible, especially with online betting or apps. What is your advice in supporting someone who is in recovery as these more accessible avenues increase? One of the things I have on my phone, there's like a blocking software that blocks sort of gambling content. Now, I don't say that that's the end game. I think I differ from some of the older GA members I've talked to. I think it is important today to have some sort of software like that, just because it is so accessible. Have some sort of safeguard like that as a first and foremost little thing. But I think the medicine really is kind of the same over the years, even though it's more accessible. I think someone that gets into a position in their life where, however they see recovery, however they find it, that they're spiritually intact, that they're emotionally fit, that they have a good network, and then it becomes just like background noise. So I think it's less about dodging every single ad and online thing, and more about becoming at a point internally where a person is not constantly battling with that sort of content being out there, and just recognizing, hey, it's there. I'm not going to run in fear my whole life, but I do have to be careful of what I visit online, what I look at. So I'd say having some concrete sort of blocking thing, but then also focusing more internally than worrying about all that stuff, even though it is out there. That's how it's worked for me, at least. And I'll put my info on here as well, just in case you guys want to. I always give these sort of talks or these presentations. I have a few different talks in my arsenal, and always willing to cater it to different audiences. So I don't know if the chat is blocking my face on your screen, but my face is somewhere up there, and I have all this contact information as well if you want to stay in touch with me. Hey, very quick little self-promotional plug here. Dr. Phil is coming out very soon with a special on online gambling, and I don't have the date yet for when it is, but I will be on there talking with the man himself about online gambling and some of my experience. So if you're a daytime television aficionado and you like Dr. Phil, he's coming out with this new network, and I will be on there. So I'd love it if you guys tuned in. And I'm sure I'll be posting more about it on my LinkedIn or my Instagram page.
Yeah, feel free to share that with me and I can share it out in like my follow-up email. That's
Oh,
awesome.
great. Yeah, thanks. Cool.
Yeah.
Let's see who else is still on here. Oh, Brian is here. Okay. I'm sorry. I was just kind of seeing what was going on in the chat box. We have a few more minutes. Anyone with some more ideas or questions or just concerns? Mallory.
I
Yes.
I don't have the answer to this, Saul, but I just figured because we're having the conversation about it's complicated, right, with school and policy and what for students who are actively maybe gambling on their phones, it just makes me, or it's making me think about, I want to say it's Manchester High School, but they're piloting something. I know I'm talking Connecticut now, and that's not
Oh, that's okay.
my language, but I know that I think that they're piloting this idea that they put the phones in bags or something, or they have the phones outside of the classroom. And to me, I feel like that might be the only way that we'd be able to mitigate at least gambling for youth inside schools. Because yeah, it's complicated because you can't really tell someone that they can't have their phone with them, right?
Right.
But yeah, when you think about like obviously alcohol and substances, that's going to be a lot more. Oh,
I
good.
think
Maybe people have opinions on this.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say real quick, and I'll get to the hands so we have enough time. I think it's difficult when you might need a phone if there's an emergency and if someone's family and then the parent
Yep.
can't reach the kid. I feel like that could have some implications. But I see Melissa's hand first, and then I will get to Matt. All right, oh, there you go. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Just really quick, I remember in my past life, I used to work in schools. I think it's way kind of bigger than just the phones. Maybe it's like the school culture in and of itself. I remember when I was, helping out the school social workers, there would be custodians, SROs betting on the actual high school basketball team. And then, they're like dapping them up saying like, oh, I got money on you. You better play good tonight. And I think that's just the culture of the schools as well. So I just want to keep that in mind as well when you talk about school policies and the employees and, the staff and admin that are in the schools are a big kind of modeling behavior for the kids as well.
That is a really good point that I'm glad you brought up. Yeah, the whole school culture, and that's, I'm really hoping that more of these talks I get to do are with faculty as well, and not just the kids. They're not just geared toward the kids, because you're right, the faculty need to know and they need to be practicing better than they are. See, Matt, I see your hand is still up there.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much. Saul, I think it was awesome. And, really quick, Melissa, to your point, just to touch on that too, ESPN put out an E60 a few years ago, which is like a documentary series. And it was about South Florida youth football and how parents in the stands were betting on, 7-year-olds in football in the stands. And it became, a really big issue down there in Florida. But Saul, just a question for you. Do you feel or do you find or know of any other possible educational tools or resources that we could use in a school setting to help educate students maybe further, like kind of like action steps moving forward after today?
Sure. Well, I guess my initial one is just self-promotion of myself. Hey, I'll come out there and talk to them. But beyond that, I know some states, and I don't know up in Connecticut, I know there are some state kind of sponsored resources. I think North Carolina has something called the Stacked Deck program that they've implemented for a while that I think also teaches kids about probability and things with math and finances. I would say that's really the main one I know of, other than just having, I've seen schools will have things like just stuff put out on a table, tabling things. So I don't know if that's kind of a crummy answer. Sorry,
Oh, helps.
yeah,
Thank you. Thank
sure.
you.
So
I mean,
I
I
can
try to
add
leave.
to that. So here in
Yeah.
Connecticut, we do have stacked deck, and Dina is going to be going through the training in a few weeks. It's going to be April 10th, 11th, and 12th. And the issue we run into is that it's a 6-part curriculum. And so it would be that either Dina coming into Region 1 or someone from your school would come in and facilitate the training. It's very interactive. It's really great with students. It's the only evidence-based curriculum out there right now for gambling. It would just be if you had a way to get it into your classroom or into your school that would be available for you. So if we could just get through that barrier of allowing the schools to let us in for the 6 full parts so that it covers all of the information needed. So it's there if it's available.
It's good that you guys have these resources. With Texas, I am kind of limited. I mean, I mentioned different recovery groups, and I try to give resources at the end of my talks to the kids and talk about where all the meetings are and everything. But Texas is really just pretty sparse in terms of what you can find. So at least at this point.
And Matt, if you wanted to get trained, you can also participate in the training too. It's going to be free for Connecticut providers and people on the regional gambling awareness team. So if you participate in Region 1, then you would qualify for that.
Great. Thank you so much.
Right. Well, do want to be mindful of everyone's time. I see it is 7, I guess 8 o'clock your time. So oh, thanks, Dr. Phil. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what they come up with too with that. Dina, any sort of wrap up ideas from you? I'll swing it back to you here.
Yeah, just a huge thank you for sharing your story and being here tonight. And I encourage everybody to reach out to me if you do want more resources. Feel free to join our gambling awareness team, and I will send out a follow-up to this. We recorded this, so we can share it with you. And I was looking over Saul's website right before this presentation. He has many resources and many things to look at, and the Hub's website also has a lot of great resources. So thank you all for coming. And
Oh, I was going to ask, sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt you really
It's okay.
quick.
Go
Does
ahead.
anyone in the meeting mind, because I like to keep my LinkedIn active, does anyone mind if I take a photo of this screen here of people on here to share to my LinkedIn, or if someone has an issue, I won't do it, but oh, okay,
Yeah, go ahead.
here we go. All right.
Smile.
There we go. Cool. All right. Thanks.
I was also taking some screenshots during your presentation with some great points that I can share with you as well if
Oh, cool.
you'd
Yeah,
like.
that'd be nice. How do I stop screen sharing? Oh, there we go.
There we go.
That's what I wanted to do. Okay, thanks. All right, y'all.
Yeah,
Well,
thank you, everybody.
this was nice. Yeah, appreciate it.
Yeah. And I always say if I will never always have a question right on the spot, but if you remember when you're trying to fall asleep tonight, send me an email.
Okay.
I will not respond at midnight, but I will get back to you and hopefully answer your question as best as possible.
All right. Thanks again. Have a good night.
Thank you, Saul.
Good night. Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thanks, Dina. Thanks,
Thank you,
Saul.
Kelly.
Bye. See you soon.
Bye.